Selamat siang.
Selamat
Hello,
siang,
everyone.
How are you, Pak?
Ibu-ibu dan bapak-bapak. Thank you very much for joining me today. I really want to thank FPCI for organizing this, and Cindy and Reynaldi, it's great to see you again. I look forward to you facilitating this. I will be speaking in English today, but if you do have questions at the end of the presentation in English or in Bahasa, I know that Cindy and others on the line may be able to help me understand your question, and then I'll try to respond in clear English if I can. So I'm really excited to speak to you. I believe all the students today are from the Jakarta region. Of course, that's where I'm based as well. So I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person, but instead we will do this virtually. I want to speak to you today about Canada, about what it means to be Canadian, and about how Canadians see the world. And I think you may be surprised at the many similarities between Canada and Indonesia. After that, I want to talk a little bit about the world we live in today and how the COVID pandemic is reshaping it. And finally, I'd like to talk about how we move forward together, both in the Canada-Indonesia bilateral relationship, as well as how our two nations are coordinating and cooperating, working together internationally. And finally, I very much look forward to your questions and comments at the end and some open conversations, suggestions. That'll be the best part of the presentation for me. First, I want to provide some background to help explain Canadians, who we are, Canada, my country, and why we see things the way we do. A key aspect of diplomacy is to see how others see things and to understand how they see you. And indeed, Canada and Indonesia are thousands of miles, thousands of kilometers apart. And on the surface, we look like very different places. But actually, in fact, we have many things in common, and we share some important values that are fundamental to who we are and how we all see the world in our two countries. Our respect for diversity and inclusion, our dedication to democracy, our shared belief in the responsibilities as citizens in those democracies are values that bring us all much closer together. So today, for the next few minutes, I would like you to imagine briefly that you are not Indonesian. Instead, imagine that you are Canadian. Like Indonesia, Canada is extremely diverse, both with respect to its geography and its people. So as a Canadian, you might have grown up on a vast prairie dominated by grain farms and cattle ranches. This is where my ancestors are from. Or you might come from a temperate, cool rainforest on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. Or as a Canadian, you might have grown up in a small wooden house that your ancestors built in a fishing village on the Atlantic Ocean facing Europe. But most likely, you are from a modern city of at least 1 million people. And whether your family is high income or low income, you almost certainly received a world-class education at a public, that is to say a government-run elementary and then secondary school. And now, as students, you are studying in an excellent public university. Almost all of the universities in Canada are public, not private. The tuition you pay to go to school is very low compared to other countries, developed countries like the United States. And as a Canadian, if you cannot afford to pay for university, if you come from a low-income family, the government will loan you the money to get an excellent post-secondary education. And by the way, if you get ill at any time, whether you are rich or poor, you will go to a public hospital and the government will pay the bill. Like our universities, our hospital system is public, not private. It is possible that your ancestors were indigenous North Americans, but it's much more likely that they were immigrants. probably from Europe or Asia. That's the majority of the Canadian population. They likely left their home country to seek better economic opportunities and to live in a country where the government is democratically elected and therefore dedicates itself to making life better for its citizens. If you're from Toronto, Canada's largest city, you speak English at school or at work and on the street, but there is a 50% chance that you are an immigrant born outside of Canada. 50% of the people living in Toronto were born outside of Canada. So at home with your family, you likely speak one of the more than 100 languages that are spoken in Toronto. And if your parents would have sent you therefore to a language school on Saturdays to ensure that you learned how to speak good Greek or Ukrainian or Mandarin or Bahasa Indonesia so that you can keep your culture and your language and still be Canadian. The same would be true if you were from Vancouver, which is Canada's most Asian city, where more than 70 languages are spoken, and about 50% of the residents do not speak English in their homes. They speak typically an Asian language at home and English on the street. And of course, if you're from Montreal, the second largest French-speaking city in the world after Paris, you almost certainly speak French at home and on the street, plus excellent English when you need to. And you probably dress more fashionably than your English-speaking classmates. It's a stereotype in Canada that the French-speaking Canadians are very well dressed. Let me turn now to a brief video clip to give you an even better sense of what life is like as a student in Canada.
When you think of endless possibilities, what do you think of?
We think of potential.
We think of self-fulfillment.
And we think of the freedom to choose a life and future on our own terms.
We think of cultural diversity, endless horizons, and infinite opportunities.
And we think of here, and here, and of here. These are the places where students from around the world come to be challenged, to grow, and to immerse themselves in a rich and high-quality learning environment.
It's where you'll find the visionaries, the innovators of tomorrow, the challenge seekers, and the future leaders.
It's in these halls, these theaters, and these labs that theory meets practice, and effort and action leads to real futures.
We believe that Canada is the best place in the world to get an education, because no other place offers such a world of possibilities.
Sorry, I think I was on mute. For those of you who are interested in studying in Canada, we do have a virtual education fair coming up this Saturday, October 3rd, and another one on October the 10th. And at the end of this presentation, Fajar will again share this information so that you can register on October the 10th if you're interested. For most Canadians, for most non-Canadians, it's very difficult to imagine just how multicultural Canada is and how that affects our worldview. To ensure we all get along and prosper, we have tolerance built into our DNA, which is not to say that all Canadians are tolerant, of course. We too have bigots and racists and misogynists and religious fundamentalists, just like every other country. But the great majority of Canadians have no tolerance for those who hate based on the color of someone's skin, or their gender, or their beliefs about religion, or who they choose to love or marry. And this is another point that both of our countries share. Canada and Indonesia are much more than political boundaries drawn on a map. Our countries are more than natural beauty and diverse populations. Our nations are fundamentally based on a core idea that diverse groups of people representing a wide variety of ethnicities, religions, languages, and cultures can live peacefully together, grow strong, and prosper, not despite our differences, but because of our differences. So, still imagining that you're a Canadian, coming from that background, I'd like you to imagine now that you work as a Canadian policymaker or diplomat, like these young Canadians. To be a diplomat, you first need to understand your neighbors. To the north of Canada, just across the North Pole, is Russia, formerly the Soviet Union. To the west of Canada, just across the Pacific Ocean, is Asia. Closest are China, Japan, and Korea, and further south are countries like Thailand and Indonesia, which as a Canadian you have always believed is a tropical paradise. To the east, across the Atlantic Ocean, is Europe, home to the great wars of the last century, and now home to the European Union. And of course, to the south, a country with whom you share the world's longest undefended border is the United States of America. 200 years ago, you fought a war with that neighbor and you burned the White House to the ground. But since then, you have both agreed that war makes no sense. So instead, we have almost entirely integrated our economies. As Canadians and Americans, we now say we don't just trade, we make things together, from cars and aircraft to software and food, with goods and services transiting across the border in the billions every day. So as a nation, Canada is surrounded by superpowers, including the world's greatest superpower, the next up-and-coming superpower, China, and ancient superpowers like Russia and Europe, who still aspire to global greatness. So let me summarize. As a Canadian, you come from an incredibly diverse and tolerant country where the government strives to ensure equality of opportunity for all citizens. Your country has serious problems, like all countries do, but as a diplomat, you know that your country and all its citizens will be best off in a world that is peaceful and tolerant, where individuals are free to think and say what they want, and to do business and to trade freely, and to be protected by the rule of law at home and internationally. A world of might makes right, where the rich and powerful can get what they want, regardless of fairness or the impact on the poor and the weak, is not a world that reflects your interests or your values. So that is how, as the ambassador of Canada to Indonesia, I see the world. Let me now speak briefly about how I see the world in the middle of the greatest pandemic that we have seen in a century. COVID is clearly not just a public health crisis. The need for physical distancing to control the spread of the virus has triggered a global economic crisis, which is in turn affecting both domestic politics in all of our countries and the global diplomatic scene. As I see it, many of the political and diplomatic pressures and trends that we saw before the crisis have now been accelerated. The great power rivalry between the two world's leading superpowers and economies has intensified. Many countries are witnessing increased nationalism and xenophobia. Authoritarian governments are not letting a good crisis go to waste, and some are using the crisis to their advantage to securitize the response and strengthen their control over their populations. In many countries, there is increased concern about personal privacy and technological surveillance, which is being exacerbated in some cases by the use of tracking applications used or imposed by states and governments. Coupled with this are intensified concerns about bad actors leveraging our increased dependence on digital technology, including to influence public opinion through misinformation campaigns. So cybersecurity has never been more important than it is now. And unfortunately, especially in the first weeks of the crisis, many countries initially responded with a so-called me first attitude, coupled with blatant trade protectionism that further undermined the credibility of the multilateral system that we helped to build in the decades since the Second World War. And I'm speaking now about the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the Bretton Woods institutions, including the World Bank and the IMF. For Canada, and I think for Indonesia and other middle powers, these are frightening developments. Our countries will not prosper in a world of the law of the jungle and might makes right. So we and many other countries are instead committed to improving and adapting the so-called rules-based international order to ensure that we all benefit from the protection of the rule of international law. Let me speak a bit about our bilateral relationship. Before the crisis, Canada and Indonesia had roughly balanced trade in goods and services of over $4 billion a year. Canadian direct investment into Indonesia in 2018 was $3.2 billion, a little bit higher last year. Our second largest investment destination in the ASEAN region after Singapore. And Indonesians in turn had invested roughly $84 million into Canada. Over 2,000 Indonesians your age were studying in Canada, and Canada welcomed roughly 27,000 Indonesian tourists every year. And in turn, over 100,000 Canadians visited Indonesia every year. About 70,000 of them went to Bali. Clearly, that's all going to change now. Less so with respect to trade in goods than with respect to the services sectors that are dependent on travel, like tourism. But we need to work hard to limit the damage and lay the groundwork now for a solid recovery in the medium to long term. Clearly, no one country can face these challenges alone. So for Canada's part, we're working hard with countries like Indonesia in multilateral institutions and groupings like the G20, APEC, and of course the WTO to help us move toward a sustainable and resilient economic recovery. When it comes to multilateral institutions that are under unprecedented pressure, we can't give up on them. Within the G20, we're working with Indonesia and others to commit ourselves to preserve the flow of vital medical supplies, critical agricultural products, and other essential goods and services. At the onset of this pandemic 6 months ago, Canada acted quickly to take a leadership role. Canadian Foreign Minister Champagne, together with foreign ministers of several G20 countries, including Indonesia, and other non-G20 nations, established a new multilateral coordination group on COVID-19. This ad hoc group helped to facilitate the cross-border movement of goods, services, and people in the days after the pandemic to maintain open and connected supply chains and ensure that those most in need receive access to vital medical treatment. In that group, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi led important discussions on the role of the private sector in ensuring open supply chains. Looking ahead to a post-pandemic future, Canada continues to take a leadership role in the revitalization of the World Trade Organization through its convening of the Ottawa Group, which is working on options for renewing that critical organization. And at the United Nations, Canada has 5 key priorities with which it is working closely with all other members. At the UN, we aim to, first, sustain peace together. Second, address climate change together. Third, promote economic security together. And fifth, strengthen multilateralism together. I'd like to quickly expand on that fourth point for a moment because we need to do a much better job of enhancing gender equality. This is true in Canada, in Indonesia, and everywhere around the world. We've all seen the benefits when women have equal power and are involved in all aspects of decision-making, in business, in peacekeeping, in politics, in every aspect of our lives. All aspects of society improve when we include women and we are more gender equal. So we all need to do better. Before we move into questions, I'd just like to take a moment and recap some of what I've said. As Canadians, like Indonesians, we believe in the importance of inclusion, acceptance, and cooperation. We believe it is in our best interests to live in a world where these values are broadly shared. The current COVID pandemic has simultaneously challenged these values while making them even more important. And moving forward, we need to find ways to work together and prosper, both in our bilateral relationship and to protect and strengthen the important multilateral systems that we've spent decades building. Whatever solutions we come up with, finally, we need to have gender equality at the center. So as we all struggle to manage our response to the COVID crisis in the short term, we should keep a focus on our long-term strategy and look to the future as we make decisions now that will pay off in the years to come. There was a famous Canadian ice hockey player. His name was Wayne Gretzky, the greatest hockey player who ever lived, who famously said, "Do not skate to where the puck is, skate to where the puck is going to be. Think ahead, plan ahead, and act." With that, I'm happy to go to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the presentation. So I wanted to welcome the students that we have today here with us. So we are joined by students from the greater Jakarta region, namely Universitas Indonesia, BINUS University, Universitas Bakri, Universitas Jayabaya, Universitas 17 Agustus 1945, LSPR Institute, and President University. So again, welcome everybody, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. So from Ambassador MacKay and his lecture, we got to know Canada as a country a little bit better, and we gained new perspective on how Canadians see the world. And we also learned about the current bilateral relations between Indonesia and Canada, as well as Canada's role in the multilateral field, especially in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. So ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and dive into our question and answer session. So please don't be shy and feel free to ask as many questions as you can. And I will be taking 3 questions per batch, which will be then answered by Ambassador MacKay before moving on to the next batch. So to ask your question, you can use the raise hand feature on your Zoom app by clicking participants and then selecting raise hand on the bottom right. And I will be choosing the first people who raise their hands. So please raise your hands now. Okay, for the first question from FPCI BINUS, Osvaldo. Please state your name and your question, but please do limit it to 1 question per person.
Hello, my name is Osvaldo from FPCI BINUS. I would like to ask, how did Canada settle its tax rates and citizen satisfaction level, considering countries with high taxes have low satisfactions towards the government, especially during COVID? And Canada has quite a high satisfaction level towards the government. What are the insights that can be implemented in Indonesia as well?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Maybe I can say Canada does have, I'm going to say, high taxes relative to Indonesia. I don't recall the figure, but I think it's roughly 30%. The Canadian government taxes about 30% of the Canadian economy, and I think Indonesia is about 9%, which Indonesia has extraordinarily low taxes and extraordinarily low tax compliance, meaning that the government doesn't gather all of the taxes that are owed to it. Canada has relatively high taxes and relatively high tax compliance. There are, of course, Canadians who don't pay their taxes, but they're relatively few, and usually they're caught and forced to pay the tax. Our tax rates on corporations are very competitive. We have relatively low taxes on corporations, lower than the United States. But we do have income tax, so-called progressive income tax, meaning that wealthy people pay higher taxes. Low-income people pay relatively low income tax. Very low-income people pay no income tax. And we also have a goods and services tax, that is charged on anything that you buy in a store, whether that's a good or a service. We have a national tax in that regard, and we have provinces that also have similar sales taxes, basically. So we do have a complex tax regime, but frankly, from a business investment point of view, it's very competitive. Very competitive with the US and Europe in particular. And frankly, it's those taxes that allow Canada to provide very high levels of government service. So I mentioned that we have public universities, public hospitals, all of the Canadian schooling system, the great majority of it is public. These are all paid for, via taxes. So certainly it's been Canada's experience that if you want to have a strong education system and a strong health system, and if you want to have rough equality of opportunity to that system, whether you're rich or poor, if you're born into a rich or poor family, frankly, you should have an excellent education regardless of your parents' income. That's the Canadian view. And that can only be achieved by everyone paying their fair share of taxes. So in fact, I would take issue, you mentioned one point that countries with high taxes have low satisfaction with government. I'm not sure that that's true. Of course, people who pay tax, don't really like to pay tax. And there are always going to be some who complain about, rates of high taxation, but Canada, like Scandinavian countries, Sweden, it's taxation that allows us to provide high public service and again, equality of opportunity. So most Canadians are broadly satisfied with the tax rates we have and the rate of tax collection we have, which is relatively high.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. So moving on to the next question, we have Alif Ridwan from President University.
All right, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much, Ambassador. I'd like to ask if I can compare your country, Canada, to the United States, your neighbor country, your politics seems to be more stable than the US. Could you please share us why is that your politics is much more stable compared to the United States, and probably it will be a good example for Indonesia as well, I believe. Thanks.
Let me say I think that's a fascinating question, and I think it would be a great topic for a PhD thesis, actually, about some of the differences, especially right now, between Canada and the United States and the levels of political division. I mean, first, let's just say that in the United States now, I think everyone acknowledges that political divisions are extremely high. I don't know if they're higher than ever, but they're at historic highs, I think, and a deeply divided country. Canada, like every other country, also has political divisions. We have we have three major political parties: the Liberals, the Conservatives, the New Democratic Party, and those who support those parties tend to really support their own party, and they really don't like the other ones. So our elections are also hotly contested, et cetera. But it is the case that once a government is elected, most Canadians, most of the time, rally behind the duly elected government. And I think that goes back to the founding of the country. Canada is one of the world's oldest democracies. We've spent more than 150 years improving our democracy. Our democracy still needs a lot of improvement. We have a lot of debate about that within Canada. It's not at all perfect, but I think most Canadians think that it's pretty good. And I think, therefore, once we have an election and there's an outcome, most Canadians accept that outcome and support the government. Our system of government is very different than the United States. Canada is not a republic. We're a constitutional monarchy. Our parliament does not look anything like the US legislative system. It's based, broadly speaking, on the United Kingdom system of parliament. We have a House of Parliament and a Senate, and then the executive with the Prime Minister and staff, et cetera, and ministers, and a Supreme Court. But it functions quite differently than the United States, and that produces different outcomes. So I think Canada's political stability is something we've fought hard for. It has taken us, like I said, more than 150 years to get to where we are. But at the end, it produces a result that, frankly, most people find credible. I think a key aspect as well, I mentioned earlier, talking about tax rates, equality of opportunity is relatively high in Canada, and that satisfies people. Again, whether you're born rich or poor, you will get access to the same healthcare and you get access to the same educational system. And that goes a long way to lessening income inequality and all of the divisions that can flow from that. Indonesia is a very new democracy, of course. I mean, just over 20 years. So it's frankly very impressive how far Indonesia has come so far. But of course, there are serious challenges here because democracy is quite new. And no democracy is ever perfect. We will always be improving on the system forever. That's the point of democracy.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, moving on to the next question from LSPR, Khalil Atala.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon, I guess. Okay, so I was browsing through Google through a website called Nambeo, I think, and I find that Canada's crime rate is quite moderate, low to moderate, right? So I was asking, how does the what are the steps or policies that the Canadian government take to suppress the crime rate in Canada? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, like with that's a great question. Like with every political debate, there's also a real debate in Canada about crime rates. They are low compared to our neighbor in the United States. They're extraordinarily low compared to the US and many other countries in Latin America, for example. But there are even lower crime rates in places like Finland and Japan, and Canadians always aspire to do better than we have. I think some of the key ingredients, frankly, go back to what I was saying earlier, this equality of opportunity and the fact that we have a very well-developed social welfare system, meaning if you're low income or if you lose your job or if you fall ill or you become disabled, there will be a program that somehow takes care of you and takes care of your children. Those programs are not perfect and we can always improve them, but frankly, they are pretty good compared to most countries. And that goes a long way to taking away the incentive for individuals to commit crime. We still have to do a lot more on issues like mental health, and we have all kinds of problems in Canada still. Racial divisions, we do have income inequality, it's increasing, but those key factors I mentioned earlier help to keep crime rates low. There's one other key factor, and that is that, again, as compared to our neighbor, we have quite strict gun control in Canada. It is possible to buy and own a gun, but it's challenging to get a license. It's very strictly regulated. Serious firearms and automatic weapons are not legal. Guns need to be locked and licensed at all times, etc. So it's simply not easy to get a gun, and therefore our gun homicide rate is low compared to the US. But I would say, higher than Japan or some European countries. We're somewhere in the middle. So I think those are some of the key elements to keeping our crime rate relatively low.
Great, thanks, Ambassador. For the next question, from Fajar Iksandi of LSPR.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So now I know that Canada is a safe haven for immigrants, and your acceptance towards immigrants is quite something. And this tolerance contributes with Canada's diversity in culture, gender, sexual orientation, and etc. Now, I'm curious as to how do Canadians manage to be so tolerant and accepting? Is tolerance and sorry, and acceptance is implemented in and highlighted in your educational system, or is there another factor to that? And because from what I've seen, Indonesia is also a very diverse country, but I feel as though Indonesia, our level of tolerance and acceptance is quite different than that of Canada's Canadians.
Let me say first that in coming to Indonesia and studying Indonesia before I came and now that I'm here, I'm frankly really impressed with the high levels of inclusion and diversity and tolerance in Indonesia. It's really remarkable for a country of this size to be as open as it is. And I think, and you know much better than I do about all of the historic reasons for that. Of course, as you suggested, there are some serious challenges here in that regard as well, and I think that's well recognized. Canada also has serious challenges on diversity and inclusion. I mentioned in my remarks, we do have racists, we have bigots, we have misogynists and religious fundamentalists in Canada too, but in relatively small numbers. They're not politically influential, etc. I think a big part of this is that Canada is largely a country of immigrants. There are, of course, Indigenous Canadians who were in Canada from the beginning and before Europeans ever sailed across the sea and landed on the shores of what's now Canada. Those people, Indigenous Canadians, make up less than 5% of the Canadian population now, and we have some serious challenges in basically managing and improving and making reparations for the relationship between settler Canadians and Indigenous Canadians. And again, that's a whole other important topic. But broadly speaking, because 95% of Canadians, frankly, did come from somewhere else, from Europe, from Asia, from Latin America, from wherever. I think there's a broad acceptance that everybody knows we all, came to Canada relatively recently. And so again, we have more than 200 years of experience trying to all get along together, which is not to say we have no tension. There have been historically lots of tension between the English and French-speaking Canadians, between so-called white or European Canadians, settler Canadians, and Indigenous Canadians. That's all the case. But we are now absolutely a predominantly immigrant nation. We have the highest per capita immigration levels in the world, rivaling Australia, I think. And broadly speaking, a pretty welcoming environment for immigrants, including students who decide to study in Canada, and many of them stay on, work, and then live in Canada. It takes just a few years to become a Canadian citizen, and frankly, once you are a Canadian citizen, we even prefer to not call people who've come from abroad immigrants. We simply call them new Canadians. So there's all of those historic reasons and systemic reasons why our system is set up to have very high levels of immigration, and that helps to promote economic growth and promote the development of the nation.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. For our next question from Universitas Indonesia, we have Satyana Pandey.
Right. Thank you, Your Excellencies, Mr. MacKay. So I'm really interested on the point that you brought upon, the point of multilateralism. And as we know, when we talk about multilateralism and Indonesia, of course, we come down to ASEAN. And on the latest General Assembly speech brought by Mr. Joko Widodo, he brought upon the concept of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. My question is, how do Canada position itself in the Indo-Pacific region, and how can we, Indonesia and ASEAN and Canada, can benefit together in cooperation? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And once again, there's kind of no simple answer to it. We have not yet articulated a detailed foreign policy vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific region. There are, of course, some countries that are very much lining up with the free and open Indo-Pacific stance. And then there's the ASEAN led by Indonesia, the ASEAN-Indonesian view on this. Canada's looking internally now at what our own policy should be on these postures by other countries. The one thing we can say definitively is we fundamentally believe in rule of law. We fundamentally believe in sovereignty, of course, of nations, and we fundamentally believe in freedom of navigation. So those are some key principles that we've had for many, many years. We certainly see a lot of opportunity, frankly, for Canada in the Indo-Pacific region. We have very considerable and ever-growing trade from all the way across the Pacific region, from Japan, Korea, and China, very high levels of trade through to the ASEAN countries and all the way over to India. So it's a region of growing importance to us. We have many Canadians come from this part of the world, and they are driving the policy debate. But we don't have a fully articulated policy on the Indo-Pacific region yet, other than we're highly interested in the region.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. For the next question from Universitas Jayabaya, Yunita Fajarani.
I'm Yunita Fajarani from Jayabaya University. I have a question. How do Canadians handle this pandemic situation, especially in economical aspect, like how they keep it stable, etc.? Thank you.
Just to be clear, that was how are we managing the pandemic situation, including economically? Was that the question?
Yes, that's the question.
Did I understand the question correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, Canada was hit really hard by the pandemic, similar to Europe, I would say, and broadly speaking, similar to the United States or Indonesia. We've had, I believe now, about 9,000 deaths in Canada, predominantly older people. Canada has a high quality of life, and along with that, Canadians tend to live to quite an old age. The average age of mortality in Canada is 82. So we had a lot of older people die of COVID, especially in the early days of the pandemic. The Canadian government reacted, I think, relatively quickly and firmly in the middle of March. We banned all international travel, except for essential goods and services, et cetera, and essential workers. We locked down many of our cities and much of the economy, a lot like Indonesia, I would say. We were very successful early on. After the pandemic hit us hard, we did flatten the curve very successfully, so that by June of this year, we were able to reopen many of our cities and most of the economy again. Unfortunately now, we are seeing that too many people were frankly being too free in their own personal behavior, hosting parties and larger gatherings and that sort of thing. So many Canadian cities are now beginning to take steps to lock down again, very similar to Jakarta, I would say, at about the time that PSBB was reinitiated by the governor here. Toronto and Montreal in Canada were also taking steps to kind of restrict people's movements and your ability to visit friends and go to work and that sort of thing. It's been hard on the Canadian economy. There will definitely be a very negative hit on the GDP in Canada. It'll be a lot stronger than Indonesia, although we are hoping that there will be a bounce back in 2021 and beyond. I spoke earlier about our relatively well-developed social welfare programs. So we did, within the first few weeks of the pandemic, roll out a new economic response benefit plan for Canadians who lost their jobs and who were unable to work from home, that basically got cash in their hands within, I think it was 2 weeks. And they were then getting payments every 2 weeks from the government to sort of keep them going. So, but small businesses are really, are really suffering. And we're still months away from a vaccine actually being available, to us and to everyone. So we have, a long ways to go as well. Our death rate is frankly higher than Indonesia's, but lower than the US or Brazil or France or Spain or the United Kingdom. We've been very fortunate. To come back on just one more point earlier about political divisions, one thing that was quite striking in Canada in the first 2 months of the pandemic, as the Prime Minister and the premiers of the provinces took strong action to lock down the economy and try to flatten the curve, there was tremendous support from Canadians, very little criticism of the government, most Canadians saying my government leaders are making the right decisions, and politicians in Canada were all supporting one another, especially in the early days, to say we all agree these are the steps we need to take. So political divisions in the first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic were extremely low in Canada. They're increasing again a little bit more now as the pandemic wears on and different political parties are taking different views. But broadly speaking, we've done relatively well through the pandemic.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now for the next question, from FPCI Chapter Binus, Elisea Benedicta.
Good afternoon, sir. As you have said before, that Canada has a quite high taxes, and I would like to ask how this impact people with a low quality of life and low income, how they are able to pay the taxes, and or does the government has any taxes policy for lower income people? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So broadly speaking, if you're very low income in Canada, I'll say we have many different kinds of taxes in Canada, but broadly speaking, corporate taxes, income taxes on people's salary, sales taxes, which are taxes on anything that you buy, and maybe the other big group is property tax. If you own property, you pay tax to the city in which you own the property, not to the national government. So if you're very low income, you pay no corporate income tax. If you're very low income, you pay no income tax. Or as your income rises, you pay very little income tax. If you're low income, you don't, and if you do not own property, you don't pay property tax. Although the owner of the place where you live, your landlord of your apartment building, for example, probably pays the tax, and somehow you end up paying for it in one way or another. The one tax that is most impactful on low-income Canadians is the sales tax, what we call the goods and services tax, the GST. And there are provincial sales taxes as well. Although certain staple, well, in fact, food, so groceries, there's no tax on groceries or food. There is tax on food from a restaurant or prepared food, but not from grocery store food. And there are certain other tax exemptions for low-income people. So the short answer to your question is if you're very low income, you're probably actually paying quite low tax. And if you are quite high income, you're paying quite high taxes. And Canadians for decades have agreed that that's fair. Maybe I'll also note that if you're very low income and if you need support from the government for your income, we have social welfare programs. If you have no job whatsoever, you will be eligible for either basic welfare or unemployment insurance or disability insurance and subsidized and free public education and free public health care. So we do have an issue with, low-income Canadians are very disadvantaged compared to everyone else, but not as disadvantaged as they are in most other countries. And I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
All right. For the next question, another question from Binus, Said Haikal. Said Haikal, are you there?
Hello. I'm sorry for the laptop issue. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for the presentation. I I would like to ask that you mentioned earlier, we are hoping for bounce back, and I want to ask about how actually the Canadian government is going to initiate or Canadians policy to generate the bounce back, or perhaps is there any policy or any kind of plan from Canadian government to prepare the future upcoming issues followed by COVID-19? Thank you.
Mhm. So broadly speaking, our economic policies include, well, this is not the government. This is separate from the government, independent of the government. The Bank of Canada has been keeping interest rates very low for years now, and they are extraordinarily low now. And the bank has made it clear to the private sector and investors that these interest rates to borrow money and capital for investment will remain very low for quite some time, for several years, I think, till we're really through this. So that's one key element. I think the government as well has announced in the so-called speech from the throne in Parliament just a couple of weeks ago, last week, in fact, some key policy platforms to help stimulate the economy again, including, similar to Indonesia, infrastructure spending and government investment, in particular in clean technology and green technology, to try to get the economy going again. And also better developed and expanded social welfare programs for the poorest and the disadvantaged, including those who have been hit hard. So we're expanding, for example, Canada's unemployment insurance program, to widening the definitions to ensure that people who are self-employed or who are working in the so-called gig economy are eligible for unemployment insurance, so that they have some income until the economy gets going again. The government will need to come forward with a budget or an economic plan later in the fall to table that in Parliament for a vote. And all the parties will have an opportunity to comment on it at that time. And there will be a much more vigorous debate, I think, on the details of the plan. What the government has announced so far is sort of the broad direction that it intends to go. And in the coming couple of months, it needs to develop a much more detailed plan. There is a real debate in Canada, a political debate about the level of debt. Like many other countries, Canada will this year have a very large deficit. The government will spend much more than it takes in taxes. That will be true next year and the year after that probably as well. And there is a debate among the parties about how large those deficits should be, how large we should allow the Canadian debt to become, and how large we should let the debt to GDP ratio become. And so there will be real political debate about that in the coming months.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
From FPCI Chapter UI, Reza Maulana.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My question would be, when we're talking about healthcare, especially in the recent United States presidential rally, the comparative healthcare system has always been Canadian, or maybe the Scandinavian, but the main point is Canadian. I'd like to ask more about the Medicare, which has always been outspoken by one of the candidates in the US presidential election due to the access of healthcare based on the need rather than the ability, based on the need rather than the ability to pay, as well as the principle of universality, comprehensive distribution, and all is public funded. So maybe this is also relevant as a lesson learned for Indonesia BPJS healthcare systems. So maybe you could elaborate more on the healthcare system of Canada. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, as I touched on earlier, we do have a predominantly public healthcare system, and we do consider it to be universal and comprehensive in universal in its coverage, I should say, which means to say that all Canadians have the same access to the same hospitals. So whether you are a high-income person or a low-income person, if you live in Toronto, you will go to the Toronto Public Hospital. And that helps to ensure all of that equality of opportunity that I spoke about earlier. We all pay for that through, as I mentioned, taxes that are high relative to what Indonesians pay, but that are broadly comparable to the taxes paid in Europe or the United States, let's say, or in most developed countries. We made the decision in the 1960s, and even earlier in some Canadian provinces, to basically move to a completely public, what we call a single-payer healthcare system, where the government basically pays all the bills. There's still individual hospitals and frankly, doctors themselves operate a little bit like entrepreneurs themselves. Doctors in Canada are something like small business owners, but they only have one person who pays the bill to them. They bill the government directly and the government reimburses them. When I go to the hospital as a Canadian, I don't pay anything myself. I simply show them my public healthcare card, a little bit like a health identification card, and then I never see a bill for that. Now that's for core medical care. There are exceptions to this. That plan does not cover dental care. It does not cover the full cost of glasses, for example, or contact lenses. There are certain surgeries that are considered to be non-essential, and they can be purchased at a private clinic. One example, or the most easily recognizable example, is cosmetic surgery. The government is not going to pay for someone's cosmetic surgery unless it's really essential cosmetic surgery. If you've suffered from you've been in a horrible accident, your face is scarred from a burn, then reconstruction will be of your face will be covered. But if you just want to look more beautiful, the public healthcare system is not going to pay for that. So there are exceptions. The one other major exception is drugs. So more and more healthcare is frankly, the costs associated with it are the cost of pharmaceuticals, drugs. And those are not covered by the public healthcare system. So there we have a patchwork program of, you may have employer insurance, you may have private insurance. Very low income Canadians have certain government benefit programs for their drugs. But there's also an active debate in Canada about whether our public healthcare program, which is relatively broad now, but has these exceptions, whether it should be expanded still further. There's also a debate in Canada about how to improve that healthcare system, because as wonderful as it sounds, it's far from perfect, and there can be delays to get surgery, there can be delays to get certain kinds of healthcare because there just aren't enough doctors or specialists, especially in certain rural areas. So our healthcare system is far from perfect, and like everything else in Canada, we're always striving to improve it. It does come up as a topic for debate. Sometimes in the United States will develop its own healthcare system. It already has. But ours is sort of, broadly speaking, maybe a bit more like some of the European countries, especially the Northern European countries.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador. For our next question from Jayabaya, Rafli Ivan.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I'm sorry beforehand if my question having similarities with earlier question that you have already answered. My question is regarding the Canadian economic, Mr. Ambassador. I've read through some of the old articles posted on CNN Indonesia and CNBC Indonesia, in which stated that Canada, the country of Canada is entering the so-called economic recession, which on the year-on-year base, your country is having a minus 38.7% on the 2020 second quarter, if I'm correct. So my question is, Mr. Ambassador, regarding this economic effect, in which I believe there are over 30 countries now that have entered this economic recession. What is your opinion regarding the right economical steps that Canada can potentially take in order to overcome this economic recession? Do you have any opinions on that? Thank you very much.
Well, I think thanks very much for that question. I did touch on some of it a bit earlier. That the government has recently announced sort of its broad strategy to take the economy forward. Canada was really hard hit. There are various estimates out there as to how much the GDP will drop, but the GDP will certainly shrink considerably in Canada this year, and there will be next year is going to be a really hard year as well. But I think, and there's a genuine and vigorous political debate in Canada about what exactly to do about that. But I think most people agree that some of the key elements include ensuring that individuals who have lost their income as a result of the pandemic are provided with some kind of government income to tide them over until the economy picks up again, including to ensure that those retail outlets and whatnot that remain open now, there's enough money circulating in the economy that consumers are actually consuming and people are getting the goods and services that they need to survive over the next year. That's clearly part of it. Infrastructure development for sure is part of it. Real debate about how much of that should center around oil and gas versus the clean economy and the green economy, clean energy, et cetera. And low interest rates, like I mentioned earlier. I think the Canadian economy going into the pandemic, frankly, was in very good shape. It was doing, relatively well. The last time we had a global economic crisis in 2008, 2009, Canada was one of the developed countries that survived that crisis the best. For example, at that time, we had no banks collapse, no serious impact on the Canadian financial system, which is very closely regulated and has been declared many times by various organizations to be the world's strongest financial system. So the pillars and the base of our economy are quite strong. But the government reacted very strongly to try to quash the pandemic, including with strict lockdowns and quarantines. That's had a real impact on the economy, and it's a price that we as Canadians have all agreed to pay to save lives. So one element I will say that we've been very concerned about, and we've worked closely with Indonesia on, is we were really worried early in the pandemic with countries that responded to this global crisis by closing their economy off from others. And we in Canada have all studied how the 1920s, which saw a lot of economic growth in the Northern Hemisphere, was followed by the market crash in New York in 1929, and then many countries around the world responding to that by closing their borders and raising tariff barriers and tariff walls, stopping trade with other countries, and that produced the Great Depression of the 1930s, really, really hard impact on economies around the world, especially the Northern Hemisphere. We don't want to repeat that. So definitely one of the key ingredients for Canada will be more free trade, more global investment, keep the global supply chains open, make them more resilient, make them more diverse for sure, but don't close the borders any longer than we need to for goods and services, because the effects of that will be very negative for all of us.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. Moving on to Muhammad Iqbal. Please state your name and your university and your question.
Okay, my name is Muhammad Iqbal from Jayabaya University. So my question is, we all know that Canada faced many of the greatest impact of climate change, but Canada as well already make renewable energy as one of Canada's main energy source, about 70%. So my question is, can you explain us regarding Canada renewable energy policy and financing, and what Canada already do to achieve the SDGs, especially on climate change and renewable energy perspective? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great question. Just the last part of the question first, maybe, what are we doing about the SDGs? We're firmly committed to our Paris commitments. and a very clear and open supporter of the Paris Accord and the SDGs, and we believe that we're moving in the right direction. The key challenge for Canada, frankly, is that a little bit like Indonesia, we're an enormous country. We're the second largest country on the planet after Russia. We have, I believe, the largest coastline in the world, even greater than Indonesia. We have a diverse population that's very widely spread out. So transportation issues, like in Indonesia, are a big challenge for us. We're a high income country. So lots and lots of private ownership of automobiles. And we live in a cold climate where we all live in homes that we heat for most of the year. And therefore, we are enormous consumers of energy. The flip side of that is we're also enormous producers of energy. We have huge oil and gas reserves, some of which are quite difficult to reach, but some are offshore, some are in northern Canada and relatively remote, and some are challenging and relatively expensive to process and ship, especially the reserves in northern Alberta. But nevertheless, we have these enormous reserves of oil and gas, and the world for decades to come is going to need oil and gas. At the same time, we do have a very well-developed and diverse energy sector. We have considerable nuclear power, considerable hydroelectric power, and more cutting edge or alternative energy. You know, more Canadians are experimenting with geothermal and solar and hydrogen and the other fuel and energy sources that others are looking into, including some really interesting high-tech companies in those areas. So the debate in Canada, I think, is everyone agrees that we need to move to more and more renewables, but there's a real political debate about how quickly it is economically feasible to do so. Some argue that we need to focus on oil and gas for the next few years and use the income from that to help us diversify the economy and into other areas. And others in Canada are much more ambitious to move more quickly to green and renewable energy. And that's something the Canadian government, the Trudeau government, is very committed to, is renewable energy. And I mentioned in their speech to Parliament just last week, that was a key theme of the speech. And if you're really interested in Canadian politics, please follow in the coming couple of months. There will be economic plans and budget documents coming out that will provide a lot more specificity on just what the government plans to do to boost the green economy and green energy production on the one hand, and also greener and more sustainable consumption of energy. It's an enormous challenge for us.
Great, thank you, Ambassador. So moving on to the last round of questions, we have a lot of enthusiasm, Ambassador, from the students. So if you can still take maybe 3 or 4 more questions.
Yeah, by all means.
All right. So, all right, for the next question from UI, we'll take Latifa Nurul.
First of all, my name is Latifa Nurul Jannah, and I want to say thank you to Mr. MacKay for being here with us and then sharing your field of expertise. My question is actually kind of similar. It's about climate change. So the average temperatures in Canada have already increased by 1.7 degrees hotter Celsius since 1948. And along with higher temperatures and increased rainfall, Canada is going to see rising sea levels. And then in the United States of America, we have already heard about the Green Deal, which means zero emissions. And it means it will halt all of the oil companies' activities. So, and then some people are actually proposing a green energy business. So what are Canada's take to that kind of resolution? Thank you very much.
On green energy, well, as I mentioned in my response to the last question, climate change is a more and more important issue for all Canadians. It's definitely one of the key political debates we have in Canada, is about climate change and what government policy should be about that. And by the way, that debate is made even more complicated by the fact that even more than Indonesia, Canada has decentralized political power. So Canada is a federation, in fact. We were initially several provinces, individual colonies of the United Kingdom that became provinces that then united together into a single nation under a national government. But we have a clear division of powers between the national government, or what we call the federal government, and the provinces. That political power is arguably even more decentralized in Canada than I think any other country in the world except maybe Switzerland. So the provinces themselves have considerable power and political levers, including over the economy and resource development and property development, et cetera. So that makes the debate in Canada very vigorous, but also, really complicated. And frankly, it's a challenge to bring together into a single point of view or a single policy, the national government's policy and all the provincial governments, especially if, as is always the case in Canada, I'll give you the example of now, the national or federal government is a liberal government. Some of the provincial governments are liberal, but several of them are conservative. And frankly, they are opposed to the policies of the national, federal, liberal government. So this makes all of this very complicated. But I think what will drive us toward a solution is that Canadians themselves are recognizing more and more that climate change is not something we can just ignore. I think most Canadians know that we are, as I said, both enormous producers of energy, we're huge exporters of energy to the United States and elsewhere, but we're also per capita very large consumers of energy. So we have a responsibility to, to reduce our consumption and move to more green energy sources. And I think in the last couple of years, forest fires in the United States and in Canada, the warming that you described since the 1940s and the melting of Arctic ice and glaciers, more and more Canadians, especially young Canadians, can really see that climate change is very real, and it's absolutely having an impact on our economy and our lives. But it's very difficult to come up with clear decisions about exactly how we're going to move away from that. A key part of it is for sure going to be technology. That will probably drive the Canadian solution as it will elsewhere in the world. And it's for that reason that we've also really doubled down on government interest in subsidies for, tax breaks for, innovative solutions to climate change and energy problems.
That's really given my knowledge about structural political takes in Canada. So thank you so much for the explanation, Mr. MacKay.
Thank you. For our next question, our second to last question from LSPR, Dava Rizky Pratama.
Is my voice clear?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, good afternoon, Mr. MacKay. It is a pleasure to meet you today. So I want to ask about education in Canada. But first of all, correct me if I'm wrong. As far as I know, that Canada is on the third position for being the country that has a good quality education standard in the world. So my question is, how could Canada become one of the countries with the best education system in the world? Could you tell us, is there some kind of education systems or concepts that has a similarities between Canada and Indonesia? Or maybe there are some systems or concepts that could be implemented for Canada for improving the Indonesian education system? Thank you.
Well, let me say, I touched on some of these elements in my earlier remarks, but just to kind of explain how it works in Canada, we have the federal government, the national government, actually has no responsibility for education. The provision of education is entirely a provincial responsibility. So every province in Canada has its own education system. That said, the federal government has greater power of taxation, and therefore uses the fact that it has more money than the provincial governments to influence the provincial governments to kind of cooperate and have broadly similar standards across the country, including, for example, for the granting of university degrees and whatnot. But I think the key element of success of the Canadian education system is also our biggest challenge, and that is the fact that it's almost entirely public. So there are, some private schools, some individuals, particularly wealthy ones or who have children with special needs, will pay separate tuition to send their children to private school. But those individuals still pay tax for everyone else to go to public school. And the great majority, I don't know the figure, but I'm certain it's more than 90%, maybe more than 95% of Canadian children go to a public elementary school, public secondary school, 99% go to a public university in Canada. So that allows us to have a very high standard, high quality of education across the country that also provides for that equality of access and equality of opportunity I was talking about earlier. I think we had political debates decades ago, and we basically all agreed that, if you are a child, whether your parents are rich or poor, you deserve an excellent education. And the fact that your parents have a lot of money or don't have very much is not your fault. It's not your responsibility. So you should have the same educational opportunities as someone with, with more money. And no one ever questions that in Canada. Now that said, obviously wealthy people do have more resources than low-income people, and they can always invest more in their children through private tutors or special after-school programs. Or I don't want to say that everything in Canada is absolutely equal. There are exceptions to this. But on the whole, it's that dedication to a strong public education system. Again, I'm going to say broadly speaking, like the Northern European countries, that has helped us to score. We score relatively well in these international test scores. And when we don't, when we slip sometimes out of the top ranks for our education scores, it's front page news in Canada. Everybody debates about it. We say, do we need to spend more money? Do we need to spend our money more wisely? How do we train our teachers better? How do we ensure that our kids are getting a great education? I think every Canadian knows that education is the key to economic success for the nation and for individuals and families going forward. So we're kind of very dedicated to it that way. Obviously, Indonesia has a completely different system and approach, as does the United States and many other countries. Maybe I'll just offer one other thing. The very first question I think was about tax rates, and the truth is that tax rates in Canada are higher than they are here, and tax compliance is higher. If the government thinks you owe tax, you're probably going to have to pay that tax. And that's what allows for our education and our health system to work. We also have relatively low levels of corruption. There is corruption in Canada, but it's relatively low. So that and trust in government is relatively high. So we're lucky that we have, broadly speaking, a virtuous circle of people trust in the government. They trust that if they pay their taxes, they will get education and healthcare and roads and everything else in return for that, that the government is not corrupt. It's not just going to take my tax money and spend it on something else. Those elements are all mutually supportive. And it took us more than 150 years to develop that system. And it's still far from perfect.
Thank you so much for the answer, Mr. MacKay.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador, we actually have 4 more students lined up for questions. So if you're willing, all right.
Sure.
Okay, so for the next question from Universitas 17 Agustus, Siti Gina Fauzia.
Good afternoon, everyone, especially Ambassador. I wanna ask some question, but I don't know if this question have asked with another audience or not yet. Okay, my question is about how do you protect the Canadian in Indonesia in the midst of pandemic? Are they return back to their country or just stay at Indonesia, but they obey to what the government of Indonesia said?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Great question. So in the early days of the pandemic, in the middle of March, maybe 2 or 3 days after the World Health Organization declared that the pandemic was a global pandemic. The Canadian government and the Prime Minister reacted relatively quickly. The Prime Minister basically issued an address and asked, encouraged all Canadians to return home. At any given time, there are millions of Canadians traveling across the planet, living abroad, etc. And the Prime Minister's request was, please everyone come home. Because you may recall at that time, countries were starting to close their airspace, flights were disappearing. It was rapidly becoming difficult and in some countries impossible for Canadians to leave. So there were places where Canadians were on holiday and all of a sudden airplanes stopped flying for months. And these Canadians who expected to have a 10-day or 2-week holiday in some country, all of a sudden faced the prospect of spending months in a foreign country, which was not at all what they intended. So at that time, the beginning of the pandemic, we had about 3,500 Canadians in Indonesia in the middle of March. And in keeping with the Prime Minister's encouragement, the Canadian Embassy reached out to those Canadians and encouraged them to return home, or to at least think very seriously about returning home. The pandemic was looking very serious. And we talked about Canada's healthcare system. It's frankly good. And we wanted Canadians to go back while the flights, planes remain flying. So within about 2 months, about 2,500 of those Canadians did return home. There remain about 1,000 Canadians in Indonesia. Many of these are Canadians who have families here. They have husbands or wives here. They may have small businesses here. And they've decided that, really Indonesia is their home. It's where they live and they're staying here. And the embassy is in regular contact with those remaining Canadians. The other 2,500 were all able to take commercial flights home. We never did lose air access to Canada. It was always possible to fly home to Canada, typically through Tokyo or Seoul or Abu Dhabi, Amsterdam. Those flights remained flying all through the pandemic. So we, at the beginning stages of the pandemic, really focused on consular service to Canadians. And that remains a big part of the embassy's focus is on the 1,000 Canadians who remain.
Thank you, Ambassador. All right, for the next question from LSPR, we have Aliva Pudias.
Good afternoon, Mr. MacKay. I'd like to ask you a question about, from what I know, education system in Canada is one of the best in the world. And how do Canada manage to keep school having the same quality from each and other school? Because from what I know, here in Indonesia, the education system from each and other school isn't the same. I mean, like maybe the wealthy one get better quality of education.
So great question. And actually, first, can I say, I noticed the poster behind you when you were speaking. Can we go back to the speaker, to the woman who just asked the question momentarily? Can you hit your video camera again? Because you had a great poster there. Who's on the poster behind you?
It's Shawn Mendes.
And where does he come from?
He's Canadian.
There you go. So first, let me say I'm glad that you're a Shawn Mendes fan. I know he was here a year ago before I arrived, and unfortunately I didn't meet him, but great question about education. Again, we did touch on quite a bit of it before about how our education system works. And, with the federal government, no real educational responsibilities. Provincial governments are responsible, relatively high rates of taxation that allow us to invest in, frankly, a really world-class public education system. That's kind of the basic formula. It's taken us a long time to develop it, but Canadians don't really question the key pillars of it now. But maybe I'll speak a bit more about a point that I made earlier, which is there are, of course, still many people in the Canadian system who are disadvantaged by low income. Although the public education system is available to all, what we're finding more and more is that the students, often students who are challenged in Canada or who are struggling the most in the education system, are the ones who are coming from low-income families or families who are disadvantaged in one way or another. We absolutely still, unfortunately, have systemic racism in Canada, particularly against certain groups, and there are some groups of people who are really racial groups, basically, who are really struggling in some cases and in some communities. And so the focus on improving education for the most disadvantaged now is quite rightly focusing on what more do we need to do to make sure that those kids get a fair education. I'm a relatively high income Canadian. I work for the government. I have a government salary. I can afford for my kids to play sports after school. And if they need tutoring, I can pay for a tutor. My kids are now in university, going to a good public university, and I can afford all of that. It's much more of a struggle for many other Canadians. So I think I spoke about the education system earlier. I won't repeat all that, but I'll just say we do still struggle with some really serious problems in providing equality of opportunity in education in Canada. And it's they're different than, but kind of broadly similar to what you face in Indonesia, just on a different scale.
Thank you, Ambassador. For the second to last question from LSVR, Gusti Graven.
Hello, my question is a bit different from everyone. So, like, you're an ambassador. What is your advice to for someone who wants to be an ambassador? Thank you.
Well, again, let me speak about the Canadian experience to become a diplomat in Canada. And I'll speak a bit about the public service more broadly, because almost all Canadian ambassadors, with a few exceptions, come from the public service. We're career diplomats and we are career public servants. So my story, for example, is quite typical, really. My father was a police officer. My mother was a nurse. They both, in Canada, that means that effectively their salary came from taxes and from the government. I went to a public elementary school, public secondary school, public universities, 2 of them, all in Canada, and then joined the federal public service in my 20s. I got a job with the federal government. Sorry, my battery's a bit low and was running out. I got a job with the government, and I have been working for the federal government now for almost 25 years. And that's really typical. We have what we call a professional public service in Canada, where everyone who works for the government basically joins for the career. And it's a very competitive merit-based system with promotions by interview and by competition and exams all the way through our career. So in the Canadian system, if you want to become an ambassador, my advice would be study hard, get good grades. It helps to study something like economics, political science, international relations, law, but you may come with it from a background in history or English or engineering or anything else. And then if you join the public service, you have to write a very competitive exam to get in your 20s. And then if you're very fortunate, then maybe 20, 25, 30 years later, you'll have a job as an ambassador.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. And finally, our last question from Binus. We have Gabriel Caesar.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir, for coming, and thank you for the presentation. My question is a bit general. I would like to ask your take. What differentiates Canada's youth and Indonesia's youth in handling the pandemic situation? And as a final say, do you have any message for Indonesian youth, since there's a lot of misinformation that influence the young minds in a negative way? Thank you.
Great. I will say, again, that's a great question. And my own children, I have a 19-year-old son and a 21-year-old daughter. They're about the same age as as all of you. They're both studying in university now. They're doing most of their classes, they're doing all of their classes online. There are no in-person classes at their university now because of the pandemic. It's really a challenge for them. They live in apartments with roommates in Montreal, and it's not easy. And I think especially when you're young, you know, so many young people want to go out, you want to meet with your friends, you want to have fun, you want to socialize, get to know other people, you know, have parties, study together, etc. So I think the challenges are really similar in Canada and Indonesia for young people. This whole world of the pandemic is challenging, and living in a digital world is really can be difficult. You mentioned the issue of misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There are a lot of crazy conspiracy theories. And so I guess my advice would be two things, broadly speaking. One is be responsible and be careful about where you're getting your information. Just because somebody on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok says something about the pandemic does not mean it's true. You really need to go to credible, reputable media sources to get the facts and get the truth. So there are great credible media sources here in Indonesia and internationally. If you're reading in English, look at the major international newspapers, and you're going to get, you know, better information than just what somebody recorded on a Facebook video. Secondly, I would say it's also really important to be responsible and be prudent about your own personal behavior. You all have parents, and many of you are lucky to still have your grandparents with you. If you get COVID, you're probably going to be fine. If your parents get COVID, they may not be. And if your grandparents get COVID, they're at really high risk of dying as a result of this. So as much as it is, you know, a temptation to get out and socialize in big groups, not wear a mask and go to parties, and it really is important for you to be responsible in your own personal behavior. You have to take personal responsibility for your own behavior to try to stop the spread of this virus and keep your family and friends and everyone else you know, as safe as possible. So those are my two pieces of advice.
All right. So I think we can cut it there for the question and answer session. Again, thank you very much, Ambassador MacKay, and thank you to all the students for your enthusiasm and your questions. All right, so now, as I mentioned before, the Canadian Embassy has prepared a fun quiz for us. So Bapak Fajar of the Embassy will be leading the quiz. So Pak Fajar, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. I hope everybody learned a lot from the presentation as well as the question and answer session. Before we go on to the fun quiz, I would like to invite everybody to follow us on Instagram. Our Instagram account is @CanadaInIndonesia. I will be drawing questions from the post that we currently have on our Instagram page. So yes, thank you, Cindy. It's Canada in Indonesia. So if you haven't done so, I invite you to do so right now. In the meantime, I would like to also encourage anyone who is interested in studying in Canada, because I heard there's quite a number of questions about education in Canada. So if you are interested in education in Canada or studying in Canada, we have two events coming up very soon. The first one, this Saturday, we will have an online Study in Canada panel discussion. This will feature the ambassador as well as a number of panelists who are all Canadian alumni in Indonesia. So if you are curious about what it's like to study in Canada and have any other questions related to that, I welcome you to join this event on 3rd of October, this Saturday. So yeah, please go to the website. It's on the poster. And the second one is our upcoming EduCanada virtual fair. This event will take place on Saturday, October the 10th. It's also going to be a virtual event. So if you want to meet representatives from over 40 Canadian schools, including some of the best ones in the world, I welcome you to join this event. Please don't forget to register. There is the information on the poster there. So give you a few seconds if you want to write it down. It's also on our Instagram. So, okay. 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 Now let's go to the fun quiz. So, has everyone followed us on Instagram? I hope so. I'll be asking 5 questions based on the information we have on our Instagram, and Cindy will help me in choosing the persons who will respond to the questions. The first person who gets the answer correctly will receive some eco-friendly prizes from the Embassy of Canada. So if everybody is ready, I guess if somebody wants to answer, they can just raise their hand.
You can raise their hand just as you did when we asked the questions.
All right. Okay. So, all right. First question. Freedom of religion is part of Canadian identity. So, for example, in the Canadian cabinet, we have members representing different backgrounds, including religions. My question is, how many members of the current Canadian cabinets, or how many ministers, are followers of Sikh religion? The answer is A, 1, B, 2 ministers, C, 3 ministers, or D, 4 ministers. How many members of the current Canadian cabinet
Okay.
are Sikh Canadian?
Student that raised their hand from LSPR, Ricky. What is your answer?
2.
2. That means B?
Yes.
B. I'm sorry, it's not correct yet. So next person.
All right. So sorry, Ricky, but next.
It's on our Instagram.
Yes, it's on the Instagram, so you can check. Osvaldo from Binus.
Okay, Osvaldo.
There are 3 in the current cabinet.
3, that means C.
Yes.
Are you sure?
Yes, I am.
You don't sound too confident. Yeah, but you're right. Okay, congratulations. Currently there are 3 cabinet members who are Sikh Canadian, including our Minister of National Defense, Mr. Harjit Sajan. All right. So next question. Okay, which Canadian city has its own natural waterfall? Natural waterfall. Is it A, Vancouver, B, Edmonton, C, Montreal, or D, Ottawa?
From FPCI Binus, Altaf.
Oh, another Binus. Yes.
Vancouver.
Vancouver. Nope. Not correct yet. It's on our Instagram. So if you haven't followed us, please follow us. The answer is there. So who's the next one, Cindy?
The next one from LSPR, Dafarisi.
Is it A, Vancouver, B, Edmonton, C, Montreal, or D, Ottawa?
Ottawa.
Is it D?
Yes, I think.
Are you sure?
For me, I am quite sure, but I don't know.
Yes, you're correct. It's Ottawa. So in our capital city, Ottawa, we have a natural waterfall. It's called Rideau Falls. So yeah, congratulations. So the third questions. All right, the third questions. All right. It's another question about cities in Canada. So in which Canadian city can you find Canada's largest mosque? In which Canadian city can you find Canada's largest mosque? Is it A, in Vancouver, B, in Toronto, C, in Calgary, or D, in Montreal?
From President University, Alif.
All right, President University.
It's in Canada. Sorry, Calgary. My bad.
Are you sure in Calgary?
I'm sure.
Positive.
Positive?
Lock answer.
Okay, final answer. All right, yes, correct. So the largest mosque in Canada is located in Calgary in the province of Alberta. Congratulations. All right, okay, so moving on to the fourth question. Canada is very diverse in terms of geography, population, culture, as well as its culinary tradition. There's a Canadian dish called sipat or sipai. From which Canadian province is this sipat or sipai from? Is it A, Ontario, B, Quebec, C, Alberta, or D, Manitoba?
Wow, there's 20 people here. But the first one that raised their hand was from FPCI Jayabaya, Rafli.
Okay, Rafli?
The answer is B, Quebec.
Quebec. How do you know? How do you know it's Quebec?
It's on the Instagram page.
Yes. If you follow our Instagram, you would know this immediately. Yes, you are correct. Sipat or sipai is a traditional layered meat pie from the province of Quebec. Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So the fifth and last questions. It's not on our Instagram, but it's general knowledge, especially if you follow recent news. So a Canadian TV series recently made a history by winning 9 Emmy Awards. Can you name the name of this Canadian TV series that recently won 9 Emmy Awards on a single night? Yes, anybody? Which Canadian TV series won 9 Emmy Awards? I think there's somebody there.
From LSPR, Aliva Pudias.
Okay, Alifa.
Schitt's Creek.
Can you say that again?
Schitt's Creek.
Yes, you're correct. Congratulations. It's Schitt's Creek. So it's a Canadian TV series made by father and son. It's a recently made history by winning 9 Emmy Awards on a single night. So congratulations, everybody. I think Cindy will take down your details and we'll be sending you our eco-friendly gifts very soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody who participated. And for the winners, please send us your details so that we can send you the prizes. And okay, thank you, Pak Fajar, for the quiz. Now with that, I would like to give the floor back to Ambassador MacKay for your closing statement, or if you have any message that you would like to give the students.
Well, can I simply say, Cindy, thanks again to you for facilitating such an interesting discussion, and all your colleagues at FPCI for pulling together this event. It really was a pleasure to have this time, both to speak to you, but more importantly to hear some I was really impressed with the questions. Clearly, everyone who asked a question really took some time to sort of think it through and do some research. You really challenged me. And clearly you know Canada very well, even being so far away. I think you all have very bright futures ahead of you, and it was a privilege to spend a little bit of time and get to know you today, if only virtually. I do hope that we're able to meet one day in person. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador MacKay. It was our pleasure to have you. So with that, we have come to the close of our ambassadorial lecture today. Once again, thank you to His Excellency Ambassador Cameron MacKay for your time, and everybody from our FPCI chapters. But before we exit, let's have a virtual photo shoot. Since this is the last ambassadorial lecture with Ambassador MacKay, we want to go all out for the poses, okay guys? So we're gonna take 3 pictures with 3 different poses, and we'll do the following poses. So Wahyu, are you ready to take the picture?
Yes, Cindy, thank you.
Okay, so for the first pose?
It's on you, but I will count.
Sure, okay. So for the first pose, let's do an eye. Just point at yourself like this. And Wahyu, you can count down too.
Okay, we will do it in 4 times, yeah? So for the first one, in 3, 2, and 1. Wait. Again, for the second time, still the same pose in 3, 2, and 1. Okay. The third one, same pose in 3, 2, and 1. Again, good. And for the last, with the same style, in 3, 2, and 1. Once again, sorry, in 3, 2, and 1. Yes.
We have 100 people here, so this is gonna take 4 times for each pose. So for the second pose, we're gonna do a heart. Whichever type of heart you wanna do, this heart or this heart, it's up to you. All right, go ahead, Wahyu.
Okay, for the first batch, in 3, 2, and 1. Great. Second, again, 3, 2, 1. Great. The third, in 3, 2, and 1. And last one, guys. Again, in 3, 2, and 1. Great.
All right. And the third and final pose is just a point to the camera. This is to you. A thank you from us to Ambassador MacKay.
I'll point too.
All right.
Okay, we ready in 3, 2, and 1. Great. Second, in 3, 2, and 1. Great. Third, in 3, 2, and 1. Again, last one in 3, 2, and 1.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wahyu, and thank you, everybody. That wraps up today's lecture. Thank you for joining. And again, thank you very much, Ambassador MacKay and Pak Fajar from the embassy.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Stay safe, everybody.
Yes.